Hello everybody and welcome to today's SAP GRC webcast, 9 key principles to enable the long-term sustainability of your GRC investment. I'm Jamie Draper, I'm a partner with PwC's SAP Security and Controls practice. I'm joined today by Bob Clark and Brian Rizman. I'll give an introduction to those in a minute. I think many of you are probably familiar with this webcast series, so thank you very much for continuing to support it. And welcome to anybody who's new to the webcast series. We're really looking to put out our thought leadership and to share our experiences with you, and we really do welcome any feedback that you have. You can either give us feedback through the chat or you can email us directly at the end and we'll provide those details to you later on. As many of you know, one of the first things that I have to do is walk through some disclaimers and some administrative procedures, so I'm going to go ahead and do those and then we'll begin the presentation. We'll start with the disclaimer, and I'll read this as is. Certain matters reviewed today may represent services that PwC may be prohibited from providing to our audit clients. So this relates directly to our external audit clients. In those instances, the information is being provided to inform you of options that you may consider as you assess your company's approach to managing segregation of duties and sensitive access. Independence rules are complex, and we recommend to discuss all services with you in advance within the context of the independence rules. The information contained within this document is provided as is for general guidance on matters of interest only. PricewaterhouseCoopers is not herein engaged in rendering legal, accounting, tax, or other professional advice and services. Before making any decision or taking on any action, you should consult a competent professional advisor. So thank you for listening to that. And to continue with the administrative matters, to start with some general ones, for better viewing experience, close other applications. For better sound quality, use headphones. I'm not really sure how many people actually do that. But some of the interesting ones. To enlarge the slides, click on the bottom right corner of the slide window to drag the desired size, or click the green Maximize button at the top right of the slide window. The one question we get asked most often is, can you get a copy of today's presentation? Absolutely. To download today's presentation, click on the Resources widget at the bottom of the screen, and you should see the option to download. We really do encourage you to submit questions as we go through the presentation. Please submit those using the QA window on the left side of your screen. We'll answer those when we get to polling questions or at the end as time permits. If we don't get to every question, we will answer them and we will send you a response back via email as part of the follow-up. And finally, if you experience any technical difficulties with the polling questions, reply in the Q&A window to include the poll number. So the next thing is for the CPE credits, to make sure that you get CPE credits. You must stay on for the entire 60-minute program. You must respond to all of the polling questions. There will be 4 questions spaced out throughout the presentation. You must click on the CPE widget upon conclusion of the webcast located at the bottom of the screen and follow the subsequent prompts to download the certificate. And the final thing, CPE cannot be awarded for participants not logged into the webcast. So if you are listening to this on the playback, we apologize, but we can't offer CPE credits for that. To just go back to that note at the end of the prior screen, if you, for some reason, you have technical difficulties and you cannot answer a polling question, if you submit your answer through the Q&A chat, so just submit your answer as A or B, C, D, you will get the CPE credits. We can award it to you then. So that's the administrative items over. As I said, today I'm joined by Bob Clark and Brian Rizman. I'm really happy to be joined by both Bob and Brian. So to give a brief introduction to them, Bob leads our SAP GRC practice, and he's based in Philadelphia. Bob is the Global Alliances Partner for our SAP GRC solutions. In addition to that, Bob also sits on our Global ERP Leadership team, focusing on developing tools, methodologies, marketing, and training So what that really means is, Bob is responsible for setting the direction of the services we do at the global level for all of our ERP services, and then Bob drives that through to us, and we deliver that here nationally, through the SAP GRC practice. Brian is a manager in New York City. Brian has over 10 years of experience with SAP, 7 years working with PwC. Brian has worked for 3 years in London, and the reason I mention this is because Brian has just returned from London, and during that tour, Brian worked on large multinational organizations, helping them leverage their investment in GRC, and that really sort of started the work that Brian's been doing to develop our target operating model and GRC in the box solution. And Brian is, he's going to talk a lot today about that target operating model and how he sort of built that out, and then how that fits into the broader GRC in a box solution. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Bob to walk through the agenda. Bob.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. So I'm on, I guess we're on slide 5 here for the folks paying attention. The agenda is going to cover 4 key areas, but you can see we'll get into a lot of the second one. The first thing we'll cover is the definition of what is the target operating model, and what do we at PwC and our clients who've helped us through this, frankly, think of what that target operating model should look like. There's 9 key principles of that target operating model, and those are listed on the slide. So we'll be going through those in some detail when I turn this over to Brian. And they're listed there, so I won't reiterate them for you. But there's 9, and we'll get into some detail on each. Then we want to talk about this the target operating model in actual practice, right? Maybe from taking it from the theoretical level to practice. And I will say to start, this started more in practice and became something we looked at across our clients to say, how do we really, what do we see in successful programs from a GRC standpoint? And then I know we've got time for wrap-up and questions at the end as well. And I think periodically we'll stop and do some polling questions and also be able to answer some questions during that time as the answers get compiled. And so with that, I think, Jamie, we have our first polling question, right?
Yep. So to space these out through the hour, we wanted to just get a level check to start with. So the first polling question today, at your company, are you using a GRC technology platform to manage your audit and compliance requirements, i.e. SOX, FDA, etc.? So option 1 is if you're using SAP GRC, option 2, Oracle GRC, option 3, metric stream, BWise or Open Pages, option 4, another tool, or option 5, no technology. And what I'll say is I'm sure there are many clients out there that are using a couple of technologies. If that's the case, please just click on the one that you're using predominantly to manage your program in the broader sense. And one thing is that, in order to comply with the CPE requirements, we have to allow a minute for people to answer these questions. So I think I mentioned up front that we'd be talking about some of the questions that are submitted throughout the chat as we go along during that minute. We did actually get a question ahead of time, during the registration process, and Bob, I'll throw this one over to you. The question that was submitted, how can the various technology solutions, such as SAP GRC, help operationalize the target operating model?
Great, good question. That's like starting off with a good tough one. But I think the technologies are out there. SAP GRC obviously is one of the ones, and we spend a lot of time with that at our clients. Help operationalize basically by laying the foundation and what I'll call kind of the rules of engagement. Because these tools are intended to work in a certain way based on how you set them up from an organization structure, how the rules and workflow are set up. So I think the way they help operationalize is basically to allow you to enforce, for lack of a better term, and automate the rules of engagement, so that as you're doing that, you have increased confidence that the way that you intended your GRC program to work will in fact be working.
Okay, great. And I think we've given a minute there, so I'm going to push the results out. what we're seeing here is actually that no technology is the leader here, followed by another tool. I'll be honest, that does surprise me a little. I was expecting SAP GRC to be the predominant one coming up there, just based on my experience. Bob, I don't know if you have any other comments on this before we move on.
Let me just put my consulting hat on, Jamie. That's good news. Some technology help, but it is surprising.
And it's actually even better news, Jamie, because one of the principles we'll talk about, one of the key things about the target operating model is that this should be something that's thought about at the beginning a lot of times of your GRC journey. A lot of times people just put technology in for the sake of putting technology in and don't really think about how to properly integrate it into the organization. So we're encouraging those embarking on kind of that GRC journey, if you will, to consider the target operating model holistically, and we'll go through that in a bit more detail, over the next 50 minutes or so.
Okay. And just before we move on, there's been some questions about how many people are responding and do we share these. I think to the extent that we can put these together and share them with the participants, we'll do that, the results of this, as part of the follow-up.
Okay.
So moving on.
Great. So what is the GRC target operating model? In PwC, it's part of what we call our GRC in a box. And to sort of oversimplify it, then we're going to go through that as well. It really is something that puts together what we call that business as usual future state of roles, responsibilities, tasks, and the systems. And Jamie, to your point, it may be more than one system that folks are using out there. How that will look like and how people will engage with it to maintain a strong GRC program. It's more than just the technology here, and I think you'll hear us say that quite a bit, which is why this operating model was so important. We typically kind of work with our clients to say that technology is really an ingredient. It's not the actual recipe for a GRC program. So what we put together was the target operating model to, everyone's going to be different, so there isn't one recipe that will meet everyone's taste, but it definitely is a good guideline on how to form and develop what will be your GRC program. So, we look at companies that are continually investing in GRC technology, how they're leveraging those, and a lot of times we get the question that comes up of, how do we now use this? What's the best end-to-end way to make this an effective program? So what we've done is put together this model template that we're going to go through today that is, again, what we refer to as a target operating model to help put things into the right context to meet your organization's goals and objectives. When I mentioned GRC in a box, that is quite literally probably not the greenest solution I will give you to the folks on the phone from a sustainability standpoint, but it is quite literally a box that maintains or holds a lot of our thought leadership around our end-to-end vision for a GRC program. It has what I'll call kind of a simple how to explain it to the CEO, CFO messaging, down to how to probably explain it even to someone who's looking at this and responsible for GRC technology investigation at the first time. Provides overviews of methodologies for approaches and what we've seen as successful implementations, and gives overview of each key part of each of the life cycle along there. And then finally, one of the things I think that's been most important in that it does have a guided video of how to walk through a program, start to finish, with the actual demonstration, if you will, online of in this case, the SAP GRC technologies that are out there. So it's sort of a way that we provided clients with a summary of, hey, if you're looking at GRC, here's something that contains pretty much everything we think you need to think of to do that successfully. And from a target operating model standpoint, which is coming. Sorry, the slide builds here. There we go. We also get asked, and this is a question that we're frequently asked just as much by folks within PwC and then some clients as well, is why do we need a target operating model? And I think I touched a little bit. At the end of the day, the technology component doesn't really solve it. What we need is a sustainable program around that. So what we like to do is sit with clients and talk about what's coming next, and then make sure the solution is going to be developed and implemented to meet what their needs are. Similarly, because we've been around a number of clients who've implemented this and maybe are struggling and call us for help, we've seen a lot of programs that either are failing or have a number of surprises, and typically they're not the kind of surprises that are very enjoyable. So we've worked with them to develop and build an understanding of where some of the pitfalls are, and incorporated those into the consideration for the target operating model of building in from a people, process, technology standpoint what folks need to think about. And again, we're going to get into, I think, next the 9 core areas. One point I want to emphasize, because this is a question, we have clients, big and small. So this has come from, and the experience we're building on here is coming from very large multinational, Fortune 20 companies, right through to some of our middle market, private, more local companies who are also just as concerned with building a sustainable GRC program. So as I mentioned, none of this is really one size fits all. These are just the components that need to go into really developing what that operating model will be to sustain a strong GRC program. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to start talking about some of the 9 components that we talked about within the target operating model. Brian?
Perfect. Thanks, Bob. So I'm going to take you all through now in a bit of detail the 9 key components of the GRC target operating model. And I was really happy we did that poll question first to kind of see where everyone was at with their use of GRC technology today. You'll see some references in here, to SAP GRC, and we built that based on a lot of the experience we've had in the market. But one of the great things about the target operating model is that it can be extended, to any technology platform, and it really is the people and processes around the technology. So, we will take you through these 9 key areas now. The first one is what we call scope, framework, and charter. The second one are geographies, markets, and functions. Number 3, processes. People, roles, and responsibilities, number 4. Number 5 is technology. 6 is all around communication, change management, and training. 7 is the annual lifecycle, methodology, and operations. 8 is around costing, everyone's favorite. And 9 is feedback, review, and continuous improvement. And I know some of you might be thinking, where did we get these 9 key principles from around the target operating model? I would say this was probably a work in progress of over a year now, and it took a lot of whiteboarding sessions between here in the UK, the US and the UK, trying to figure out, really how do we bucket easily, the different aspects of the target operating model. So we've definitely spent some time evolving this, if you will, and we're pretty confident that, most aspects of a holistic GRC program would somehow fit into these 9 buckets here. So we'll go through a bit of them in detail. First one is scope, framework, and charter. And really what this section does here is answers the question is why. Why do we need GRC technology? Why are we investing in this program, if you will? So what this really sets out for us is the overall vision, goals, and objectives for the program. Is it because we have a compliance need? Is there new regulations coming out? Are we spending too much time provisioning users or doing segregation of duties reviews, testing, manual controls, et cetera? So really level set the playing field for the organization as to why we are investing in this GRC technology and what those drivers are. Obviously, this charter will continue to change, over time. And we'll talk about that as one of the principles is this review and continuous improvement loop, because we might need to update the charter as, regulatory and, other environmental factors change. We've set out just a high-level vision as well. As most of you, I imagine, are using a large ERP program, and whether you've had the privilege of being through the implementation of that ERP program, a lot of times we never do this in a big bang sort of way. Typically, you would see, a core deployment, whether it's based on a process or whether it's based on a region or an organization, and then you continue to enhance the functionality as the platform matures. Similarly, we would say the same thing would happen for GRC technology. And a lot of times we see, when you see this core deployment under P1, we'll see that pilot is done or the starting foundation is built around a financial controls and that repository there with some basic functionality. But as you move along the maturity, if you will, into, expanding beyond non-financial controls, and even just then beyond controls, you start seeing all the way to the right, how you can manage your policies and standards and integrate risk management holistically to the organization, fraud detection as well, which is another hot topic, and how this program itself will continue to evolve.
Yeah, and I would just add, Brian, I think one of the things we've seen with this is that just even understanding and laying out who has certain responsibilities within your organization for some of these areas is important, and then getting consensus across the company on who has and how these things fit together. Because a lot of times there are multiple compliance requirements and organizations and frameworks that people have to add to. So understanding at least what the role is and how they fit together is sometimes eye-opening and telling on how you'll set up the overall operational model.
Perfect. So one of the questions, I took a sneak peek at the Q&A, and one of the questions was, what is GRC? So GRC is governance, risk, and compliance. And really what we've laid out here is scoped by, I would say, high-level functionality, the different aspects of what we think about when we say GRC or governance, risk, and compliance. So, things related to the risk assessment, control and policy management, continuous monitoring of controls and data and transactions, as well as access management, which would include aspects like segregation of duties, user provisioning, et cetera. And when we talk about GRC technology, it is the platform or the technology that will enable all of these things to happen, and usually in a holistic end-to-end solution. So when we think of critical success factors with regards to a GRC program and the scope, framework, and charter related to it, is that the scope of the solution is clearly documented. And a lot of times you'll hear about scope creep, and everyone wants to start using it, which would be great. But really, what is the purpose at that point in time of the vision and the scope of the GRC technology and platform? We want to make sure business users are engaged. A lot of times this becomes just an IT initiative to do maybe a siloed thing by making user provisioning easier or managing segregation of duties. But when we think of GRC technology, we think of this as a business tool and something being used and integrated into everyday business and processes. As those who are using GRC technology, it can be quite complex though to get operational and set up. So we want to make sure that there's a centralized user function to help management. This helps with the user experience and really making people want to be using GRC day to day. We want to make sure the system is consistently used and that the development of it is targeted and developed over time, like we mentioned before, not big bang. I'm going to turn it back to Jamie now to do our next question here.
Thank you, Brian. So our next poll question that we've got, at your company, have you documented in detail aspects of the use of your GRC technology platform, for example, processes, and or the purpose of your GRC program? Option 1, yes, we have documented in detail the use of our GRC technology platform. 2, yes, we have documented the purpose of our GRC program. 3, yes to both 1 and 2. 4, these are either in the these are either informal or not documented at all. Or 5, not applicable. And again, we'll give you a minute to answer that question. I think we'll go back and I'll answer some of the questions that have been submitted through the Q&A. Brian, I was actually going to steal that GRC question to answer that one, but thank you for answering that.
You got it.
We did have a question around what category the CPE credits are coming in. The answer to that is it's 13 management advisory services, risk management. Hopefully that answers that question. There's been another question that has come in. I'm going to slightly alter it. The question is how many companies usually have their head of audit managing GRC process, the GRC process tool. I don't know that I can tell you the answer to that is 6,322. I think the question probably is, who's the right person within an organization to manage that tool? And it's a question we sort of get asked a lot. I don't want to dig into too much detail. We do find that a lot of companies have a control organization that looks after GRC. Audit tends to have a role in looking at GRC and making sure that it's set up and it meets the needs of the organization. But it's not necessarily the right thing for audit to actually own the tool and own the GRC process itself. And Bob and Brian, I don't know if you want to comment a little bit further on that question.
No, absolutely. It's one of the topics we'll talk about later is people, roles, and responsibilities. And like you said, it's a topic we're asked all the time. And I think a lot of it depends on the maturity of the organization using GRC technology and, and how well defined their compliance /SOX and other, regulatory programs are. A lot of times we do see internal audit do kind of own and run this, but typically I would recommend or see internal audit as being more of a user of GRC technology, but not, the custodian, if you will. We typically would try to encourage that being pushed more towards the finance organization and something like an internal controls function, or the person who's responsible for maybe your SOX program or something like that. So if I was to give an easy answer, I'd say it kind of sits somewhere between finance and internal audit in this internal controls management function, where we would typically see our GRC owned.
Great, thanks, Brian, and that's very consistent with what I'm saying. So to have a look at the answer to this, the lead answer is not applicable, but I think, I'll focus on the one above that, that these processes are either informal or not documented at all, and that really doesn't surprise me because I haven't seen that many companies really take the time to document these processes. And again, Bob and Brian, if you want to make some comments on this before we move on.
No, absolutely. I think it's quite interesting. What we've seen is that a lot of times people, just know what they should be doing, or that they kind of just used to their day-to-day jobs. But the detailed documentation of GRC processes and bringing them together holistically, we really aren't seeing as well. So I'm surprised to see a bit of not applicable. So when I see that a third are not applicable, I'm questioning, there must be some sort of reason to be managing controls or compliance at the organization. So I would, encourage that it probably is applicable in one fashion or another, that it just must not be formally maintained or documented.
I'll suggest, Brian, the not applicable may correspond to the number of answers that didn't have a tool.
Absolutely. Okay, fair enough. Good. Perfect. Let's move on to the next one then. All right, we'll talk about geographies, markets, and functions now. So one of the things to talk about here is your organizational structure and setup, and making sure that where the controls are being operated are appropriately documented and managed inside the GRC tool. So a lot of times we just think of this from a geography standpoint purely, from where there's a physical location, and that, I perform this control physically in New York or in London or San Francisco, but a lot of times there are functions performing controls on behalf of a location somewhere else, like a shared service organization, and we're seeing lots more of those, increase that the companies we're working with. So besides documenting, the physical geography or location, we're encouraging the documentation of functions as well, inside your GRC platform. And really what this does is, when I think of, this here, I'm thinking of what's important from a reporting standpoint for my organization. So do I want to report by a shared service that is supporting 15 countries in a market or a region? At the same time, though, do I want to report on one location on which a shared service is operating in control on my behalf? So what we want to think about here is that it's more than just geography, it's also the functions at your organization. When I move on to the next slide here, you'll see what this really drives is the organization hierarchy, and that's where you'll define your geographies and your physical locations. The business process hierarchy, when you have your processes like your sales process, FI process, P2P, et cetera, that's documented in what they call your business process hierarchy inside your GRC organization. One of the things to also consider is how your audit committees and internal audit organization structure is set up. just to make sure that, again, from a use standpoint and a reporting standpoint, that tool is being made optimal from reporting. Some example of functions that we typically see defined in the GRC tool would be, in addition to your finance organization, would be operations, your marketing function, IT, your center of excellence and sustainability, your audit function, HR, and legal. And these are just some examples of what we typically see as different functions defined. Here's an example organization hierarchy on top here, where you have your corporate or your group at the top and your different, childs or entities below it. What I think is interesting about the example structure below it, and this is a mapping of your geographies now to your functions. So if you take your legal or HR organization, they might just only sit at your corporate and group level, and they're not applicable in your regions or in your shared service centers. But, for example, IT might be something that's operating across geography. So it's an easy way to kind of pictorially represent how your geographies integrate with your functions. Next, we'll talk about processes. So what we have here is a framework to help establish new processes and procedures, or sometimes changes to your existing processes and procedures to support the overall GRC framework. This obviously will depend on the type of implementation going on, so the type of GRC project, the scope, who is responsible for it, as well as the inputs or outputs.
And let me jump in for a minute, because Brian, I know you see this all the time, but for the folks who, and then we've got a number who aren't necessarily familiar with GRC, governance, risk, and compliance technology that's out there, what it takes and how it can impact an organization. These processes are very important in terms of understanding how we're going to maintain things like, if we keep it real, just as simple as maintaining a segregation of duties listing and what types of transactions and activities, either manually or within your system, you don't want people to have access to either simultaneously or even just high-risk types of transactions. Maintaining that and updating that list based on current releases or patches from your software vendor. And for those of you on SAP, you're very aware that SAP releases OSS notes and patches and fixes. And with that comes new functionality. So very quickly, without any attendance, something as simple as periodic reviews of your segregation of duties list can render that SOD listing and that whole process somewhat ineffective. We're introduced again, use the word surprises at the end of an audit or end of a compliance review where you realize that there's functionality that people have access to that was really unknown. So that's what this whole area is really getting at around processes. It's not business processes, as you may think of it. It's more the processes that you need to think about that come with an effective GRC program.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bob. And so what we've done here is we've identified, over 20 key processes that would support this typical business-as-usual GRC environment. We've even, documented them and worked with organizations to develop them down to the L3, L4 type level, and I'll show you examples of those in a moment. But what we, process flowed out, if you will, is the what, the activity happening, who is responsible for that activity, when that needs to happen, what the key inputs and outputs are, and then, how is it being done? Is it being done by the GRC system itself, perhaps by the ERP system, or is it a manual process? So here you'll see, an example of here's 21, if you will, key what we call GRC processes at the L3 level. I'm sure if everyone has it, I'm sure audits going on, you have a scoping exercise to at least identify what the scope of the use of your GRC technology is. There's master data elements that need to be maintained inside the GRC system. I'm sure a lot of you have to do with looking at segregation of duties and a global access risk rule set, if you will, and how that's maintained. So what is the process for reviewing that annually, perhaps, to make sure that it is as complete and accurate as possible? Testing of manual controls, data number 10, the sign-up process at number 16, and even that all your reporting, from 17 to 21. So these are some examples of processes that we typically see maintained for GRC technology platforms.
Okay, so moving on to our third polling question. At your company, who owns the day-to-day operation and management of the GRC process? So this is a continuation of the discussion that we had during the last polling question. The options are A, the controller, B, internal audit, C, risk management, legal, D, IT, including the GRC administrator, or E, no idea. And I think hopefully this will give everybody who's asking questions around this some kind of flavor as to how diverse it is at each organization as to who looks after that. And I think Brian sort of covered where we think, certain elements play best with GRC under a broader program falling under sort of finance controller with audit playing its role. There was a question that was submitted about specific access controls, and that does generally fall under the IT organization, and specifically to the question about provisioning of users, that does go through IT security. So with that, there was a question that came in a little bit earlier that I want to ask Brian, and it relates to the actual operating model, the 9 components. And the question was around the first component, which, to remind everybody, was the scope, framework, and charter. And the question is, assuming the person is assuming the first component includes management's commitment to compliance in terms of the cultural aspect. So, Brian, I don't know if you want to expand on the impact of culture on this.
Yep, absolutely. A lot of this, in order to make this effective and operational, entity-wide, if you will, it definitely is a culture and tone of the top type thing, and making sure that different levels of the organization are bought in to the entire program, that their sponsorship starting, at the executive C-suite level, that this is something that's integrated, as a performance objective, if you will, for those responsible for its operation. And we've seen, many examples of really successful GRC programs and really non-successful GRC programs, to say the least. And a lot of it really needs to do with, the culture and attitude, for, really taking the processes that we're talking about here seriously, making sure and encouraging that the users are actually using the GRC tool and not working around it. As a quick example, I worked with an organization when I spent some time in the UK, and one of the processes we implemented was the control self-assessment, when a control owner would need to self-assess and say that they performed their control for that month. And it's, a different testing technique that we can, based on inquiry, get comfort that that control was operated. Well, they found out, though, that 3 months into the implementation that someone was just clicking, yes, 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 I've been performing my control for the past 3 months, but in reality wasn't. So they really weren't taking it seriously, the importance of being asked a simple question, did you do your control this month? And luckily, the tone of that organization culturally was of no tolerance, and that person no longer works there because of that. So a lot of it has to do with, that tone and culture, so it's definitely a great question.
One other question that I saw in here, too, that I wanted to jump in to tie into this, is the question was basically about, are we saying that one person or function is overall responsible for GRC? And they use the term, or do you need a RACI for the teams, which is perfect, because one of our and the answer is no. We're not saying that one person or one function can own this, because really, if you have an effective GRC program, it's pretty pervasive. But that definitely, we're supportive of the RACI format and approach, and actually have developed RACIs that they get into substantial detail across each each element of this, from access to provisioning to SODs. We believe very, very much that there's a detailed level of accountability, responsibility, accountability, communication in a form that needs to be put around this. It's a bit formal, and we get at first we get some eye rolls from clients when we say we'd like to put a RACI chart together. But I think whoever asked the question will appreciate that those are one way to make sure things get done. Sorry.
Great. So to look at the results, I think that just supports exactly what you were saying, Bob. I mean, this does not surprise me that the answers are pretty level across the board as to who owns it. I think, you know, IT will be there if we have a heavy security bit with access controls, the controller, internal audit, and I think it really does take everybody to make this work effectively. So, Brian.
Perfect. We will carry back on now. So talking back on processes again, here is just an example mapping of how the L3 processes from a GRC standpoint, you know, map to the various L1s and L2s. You'll see also, for an example, based on some of the shadings here, you know, what is being done in kind of the access control module, what's being done in the process control module, what's something that's happening offline. So if you were to look as an example, at 1.1 under level 3, maintaining your risk and control matrix organization-wide is something that's generally done offline, you know, with your internal audit and controls function. But then if you go to 1.2, you'll see that it then now becomes uploaded in part of the master data inside the GRC system, and there's different processes for each of these. So when we talk about a process flow, like you'll see now on this slide here, you know, here's the level of detail where we're talking about here. You know, you'll see along the left-hand side, you know, the actual role and person responsible performing that action. The different colors let you know if it's in the system, out of the system, or automated or manual. The things, the little triangles hanging off the chart are your inputs and outputs as well. You know, as we talked about, you know, originally when we talked about the processes here. So this is, and the next slide is another example, just the level of detail when we say, you know, let's make sure we have documented the GRC processes of how we should be documenting them.
And I know there's some other questions coming through around the rollout approach. And for those who've been through an SAP or an Oracle or any ERP implementation, those levels, that's what they really just get at, is to defining what the overall function is. And as you go from level 1 down into detail, and the companies call them different things. We just stuck with level 1 for simplicity. As you dive into that, and here what our level 3 is basically at the activity level. And that's where you start doing the actual process, which would be those flow charts. So I think someone asked about an ASAP methodology on implementing GRC technologies in a target operating model. And yes, there's components of that when we implement, we would follow a pretty strict development lifecycle to implement anything.
Perfect. Thanks, Bob. We're now talking about people's roles and responsibilities. And as you saw in the process flows on the left-hand side, we had clearly documented, you know, who is responsible for performing that action here. So here's how we're able to then integrate the roles that we have and the responsibilities from the process flows into the actual system or technology. So as an example, GRC process control comes delivered with standard roles and functions. So this is how we then just need to map the roles and responsibilities from the processes to the actual technology itself. This also helps us with the user administration process to make sure that the right people are getting the right access to perform their responsibility.
And again, just because I know we've got folks who may not be familiar, the process control is a component of SAP's GRC solutions. So there's access control, which handles access, that's aptly named. Risk management, which is a broader kind of the ERM side of GRC. And then process control handles, I would say, really the day-to-day compliance workflow and components of the GRC program.
Great. Just a couple other key points is that, you know, IT will still be involved from a technical role and maintenance standpoint. You know, a lot of times you'll have existing support on that platform inside your IT organization, so they'll be, you know, part of that support team. One question we do get asked, though, is do I need to create new roles, you know, or do I need to open new positions in order to manage my GRC program? I'd say one of the times we do see that happen is when the use of continuous monitoring, whether it be access monitoring, data monitoring, control monitoring, transaction monitoring on a continuous basis. You know, we typically do see, you know, a new role or responsibility in the organization. That can also be integrated, you know, into other functions there, but that is one of the questions we do typically get asked. You know, we started talking about, you know, RACI before. This isn't the full-on RACI here, but what documenting the processes and then breaking it down by roles and responsibilities by person helps us show what the key business as usual activities are, per person. So here, if you take a control owner, for example, and we say you, Bob Clark, or you, Jamie Draper, are now a control owner at your organization, what would be the things that you are responsible to do? We can now, based on those documented process flows, identify at what point in the control assessment process or when they're doing remediation plans like 1.5, what specifically they would need to be doing as part of their responsibility. We do a lot of surveying, like many organizations do, and I'm sure some of you have even been included in our survey. And one of the things that we've done is we've surveyed 75 large organizations using SAP and GRC technology to kind of get an understanding of who in the organization, or how many users, rather, are actually using GRC on a regular day-to-day basis. Most of the time we're seeing less than 500 people in these larger organizations, using the GRC tool. You'll see a couple percentage there where almost every user, it seems like, has access to GRC, and we would say that that's usually not the norm. We'll talk about costing later, and that does have a driver on the number of users using GRC, just like your ERP platform, what the cost is. But really what we're seeing is actually a shift to those doing that occasional or infrequent access. That's being now done offline in these offline forums as well. So say your CFO needs to do a sign-off annually or something like that in the GRC tool, that's now shifting to an offline form. Say external audit wants to get access, similarly that could happen as well. We also, part of that poll, just pulled the types of users using the system most frequently. I would say the biggest user communities, if you will, would be your internal control function, like we talked about, kind of managing the use of the GRC technology and solution. Your control owners and control testers, asserting that the controls are operating, and as well as performing the testing of controls, and as well as your process and sub-process owners reviewing the evaluations and making sure, everything is operating. So you can see the different roles and who's kind of using it on a high usage level versus a lower usage level. All right, Jamie, I'm going to pop it back to you for our next poll question.
Great, thanks, Brian. So the final polling question for today, at your company, is the use of GRC technology something that is in a silo or something that many people have a role or responsibility for? The options, number 1, is currently siloed. Number 2, currently many are using and have a role and responsibility for. Option 3, we're not using a GRC technology, but imagine it would be siloed. Option 4, we're not using a GRC technology, but imagine it would be used across the organization. And again, we'll give you a minute to answer that. Whilst we're giving you that minute, a couple of questions that I'll cover. There was a definitional question came in, apologize for this, around AC and PC. AC is access control and PC is process controls. Yes, they are terms that are linked with SAP's GRC tool. The access control tool is the one that looks at security and segregation of duties. Process control is the element of the tool that is used for looking at your business processes, identifying the business process controls, and then doing continuous monitoring over those business process controls. Another question that came in, and this is sort of one that may take a little bit of discussion, but I'll start to answer it. And it sort of says, what's the difference between GRC and ERM? So what's the difference between governance, risk, and compliance and enterprise risk management? And so I tend to look at ERM as being the framework that a company looks at, and it being the sort of starting point if you want to look holistically at risk across the organization. And then GRC is where you really become more tactical to look inside the organization at the information you've got, how you bring that together, and how you proactively manage that across the organization. I sort of more look at it as where the rubber meets the road. The two things are inextricably linked. simply because a lot of your reporting for ERM would come from GRC, but it may also come from other sources as well. So I don't know, Bob and Brian, if you want to elaborate on that one.
The only thing I'd add is that, if you look at it, to try to keep it simple, the ERM falls into that R of the governance, risk, and compliance, right? And can help drive that, but the GRC really adds that governance component to operationalize it throughout the actual enterprise itself. So to push that out through and down in the organization versus being, just a higher level ERM exercise across the company. You really need a effective GRC program to drive that through to make it more pervasive and sustainable from a governance standpoint.
Okay. So to publish the results for this final question about whether or not the use of GRC technology is siloed or not, looking through it, I mean, it seems to be split, almost 50-50 between those that are siloed and those that have it across the organization, and then the same with those that don't have the GRC technology. Slightly more people there do think that they don't have GRC technology. If they did implement it, it wouldn't be siloed. I think perhaps that difference at the bottom is because anyone who doesn't, a number of companies may have implemented GRC technology to get rid of specific risks like segregation of duties, so may have it particularly siloed there. Anyone looking at implementing something now, a program now, is probably thinking it through a little bit more and looking at how it'll fit across the organization. So we'll move on to the last part of the presentation.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Now we'll carry on with technology here. So just wanted to talk about here is the actual platform of the GRC technology itself. It's obviously, an important component when we talk about all of this. There's obviously cost components and things like that to consider. One of the things what we just want to talk about here, or at least is consider, is that a lot of times you'll start seeing people who are already using an SAP ERP who will naturally start using SAP GRC or like technology because they're able to extend their existing platform in order to use this module, if you will, GRC. At the same time, though, there are cost-saving options that you're not seeing things being virtualized or cloud models to, reduce initial investment. So we're seeing that consistently being done. Similarly, those who are familiar with previous versions of the GRC access control tool, that was on a technology called Java. Now it's on the SAP programming language, ABAP. So, those harmonizations make it a lot easier for organizations to in-house run and manage this type of technology. Some insight into, what IT roles will need to be able to exist at the organization to manage and run the GRC program and technology. It's your infrastructure architecture person, the person who's responsible for applications management, your SAP basis, and your SAP security team. And those are typically the 4 key technology roles that we see managing, if you will, from a technology standpoint, the system. So a quick visual summary for those who are not familiar with the landscape from typical GRC setups. You'll see in the center, you'll see that when it says AC, PC, and RM, those are access control, process control, and risk management, and that is your core GRC system or platform. You'll then see connected directly to the right where it says SAP ERP. That's your core SAP ERP environment. And there are 2 standalone technologies, and they have a connector that's built so they can, pull information and actually push information to and from each other. And then around it, you have all these optional systems, whether they're other SAP systems like your customer relationship management system, your supplier relationship management system, your BI system. But similarly, it could be other non-SAP systems that also connect to your central GRC platform. So say in Brazil, you're using JD Edwards, you're using Oracle in Asia Pac, and using SAP in North America, you can ideally have a centralized GRC platform that would be able to manage all 3 of those ERPs globally. And just understanding what you need to connect your GRC system to from a core ERP standpoint is important as you go through your vendor selection process to help you understand, what technology makes sense for managing this.
And I know, or I get the sense from some of the questions that there are folks who may be looking at this saying, why is that relevant? And I think when you think of how across an enterprise, the data within your ERP can help you manage controls and manage compliance, being able to hook into your ERP systems to understand how you're complying with FCPA, for example, by looking at certain expenditures within criteria, or looking at certain configurable controls that govern how your invoices may be processed, are important to maintain appropriate compliance and control. So those links into the systems either are confirming your system's configured a certain way to operate and support your business process, or they're intended to go in and get data, do an analysis, and come back and give someone actual information to make a compliance-related decision, and or to spur an activity if something's triggered. So that's why we showed this. It's, to give you an idea, there's a certain connectivity that's very relevant into your operational platforms.
Perfect. Thanks, Bob. We'll carry on with communication, change management, and training. Just like everything else at the organization, your ERP system, your policies, procedures, et cetera, change management activities are required to support the optimization of your GRC program. We need to make sure that if a change happens in the organization, that is appropriately reflected in the GRC system, and having those processes we documented before, helps ensure that does happen. Continual communication and training are core elements of this to make sure that new joiners in your organization are up to speed on the GRC processes and program at the organization. And the best extent we can formalize all this will really make sure that the long-term sustainability of the use of this GRC technology and investment, is realized. We put together just some examples of what a training and communication program could look like. An introductory GRC awareness training for stakeholders, specific new user training for all staff, based on their role and responsibility. So we could have a training for your control owners, a training for internal audit, et cetera. There could be an ongoing update compliance type training on an annual basis to make sure that they're familiar with, the system and the tool itself. We simply want to treat it like any other major technology platform and in process, at your organization.
Brian, let me jump in because just from a time perspective, I just want to respect everyone's time. And I know CPE, you're getting an hour, and many people want you to go past that hour. Unless it's tax, we'll sit for 4 hours for a tax hour. But what I wanted to do is maybe jump to some of the relevant parts of this and maybe provide more of an overview of what's in the deck, because we will be distributing that so folks can look through. And I think if I focus on one of the key areas and slides that I did want to just cover, and I think I can present here, right, is not that one. Bear with the technology guy to focus on this. There we go. But what you need to think about from an annual perspective, and again, we have things in here on costing, but I think from an overall, what are some key areas of sustaining the program that have to get done annually? This is just a good slide to kind of give you an idea of what you may need to think about from an operational standpoint. And it's part of, again, when you're thinking operating model, you're thinking day-to-day activities, annual activities, as well, to say, look, what do we need to make sure we're doing so this doesn't get stale? From a costing standpoint, we did put some information in here to give you an idea of exactly what the cost could be. There's technology, there's landscape. I think the key to this is to not go into that and underestimate or even sometimes overestimate, because a lot of times it does get overlooked, and at times the cost of noncompliance can be greater than the cost of the compliance program. So sometimes you want to look at that and make sure you're making an informed decision on what your program is going to look like. We provided, again, very SAP specific, but some cost drivers there. I will say that if you are an SAP shop and implementing the GRC solution specifically for those of you on who have that, A lot of times the GRC is maintained by that same support organization that's already out there that's doing your core ECC system. I think from, to kind of wrap up then, what I'd like to cover is the maturity curve. And Brian, if you want to cover some of that, we can get to the wrap-up.
Perfect, absolutely. So the last section here is what we call the feedback loop, if you will, and the continuous review and continuous improvement, like we set out before when we started. So as you know, the vision, the scope, the purpose, if you will, of your GRC program will continue to evolve and continue to change throughout the course of its existence, if you will. So we've set out our 4 stages, if you will, along the maturity curve for your GRC program. First, when you are envisioning, the expected value, if you will, and strategy of the program itself and setting up that roadmap in stage 1. Stage 2 is when you're, looking to improve or enhance the organization, the processes, the technology itself. 3 is when you're putting it into the day-to-day operation and actually getting the value captured or realized, if you will, on the initial investment and time and effort it took to establish it. And 4 is the sustaining of it, and that's really looking to see how we can further review and change and refine the overall operating model. And this is, like we said, a continuous loop that happens in different stages. So, today you can be in that sustain mode, but then tomorrow you can be right back down to stage 1 as you're re-envisioning the strategy, of your GRC program end to end.
Okay, thank you, Brian, and thank you very much, Bob. As we're at time, I'm going to wrap up, but thank you everybody for joining. Again, just what I said at the beginning of this, really appreciate everybody's support in participating in these webcasts. We really do look forward to presenting this information to you with our thought leadership around SAP, GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. The next webcast that we have planned is for July 30th. And this should be an incredibly interesting topic. SAP have come out with a new tool, fraud management, SAP's fraud management, that works on their HANA solution. And we're going to be talking about what's coming with HANA, how to implement HANA, and what the benefits an organization can get through the continuous monitoring that's provided through that. So thank you very much. Again, in order to get the CPE credits, please complete the survey. Thank you, everybody, for joining.